Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. I'm Shreya Kothari and I'm the program manager at UpGrad. And I would like to take this opportunity to first of all introduce Nate. Nate Clinton is the managing director of Cooper San Francisco. And prior to Cooper, Nate has held several responsible positions in top management in the fields of user experience and comes with a huge experience in design thinking, strategizing, and making sure that the entire user experience is really great. So I'll leave it to Nate now. He'll take over and he'll basically explain, what's the difference between UI and UX? Why is UX important? What are the different phases which a UX designer has to know about? And he'll also, in the end, we will have a Q&A session where he would be basically taking up your questions. So if you see on the right side, you have an option to put questions in the chat. So you can actually paste your questions there, and I'll be taking those questions, and we will answer them at the end of this webinar. So this is more about it. Over to you, Nate. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm broadcasting from the UpGrad office in Bangalore, and so what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about user experience design from the perspective of Cooper, and also kind of talk a little bit more broadly about the industry. And I'll talk a little bit about my background, and sort of so you can tell the perspective that I have, and that will help you ask the right questions, I guess, so that I can help you understand this field a little better. And yes, I'd love to talk a little bit more about just the various pieces of user experience design, especially the different roles that we see in the industry today, and what I think are really great opportunities for people to break into the field, especially in the areas of design research and user interface design and design strategy. So I have some slides to share with you, and I'm going to switch over to those so I can kind of share some of that content. So just give me 1 second. And can you see the slides now?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so I'll get started. So my name is Nate Clinton, and as I was introduced, I'm the managing director of Cooper San Francisco. Cooper is so today I'll tell you a little bit about what UX design is, why it's a great career, and some ways that you can think about breaking into the field or kind of getting more skill in this area. The Cooper is a design and strategy agency, and we're based in San Francisco and New York City. We have clients all over the world, and we do a lot of different things, actually. So and I'll share our process with you in a second. But basically, we do everything from conceiving of new projects and new products and services through to kind of creating a strategy for building them, and then to execution and designing those products and services. So here's how we do this. We always start, so every project we do, of course, is different because each client has different needs. And so what we do is we tailor the process to that particular client. Of course, you in your own company will have to tailor a process that fits your company's needs, just like we would. But this is how we kind of think about the project work that we do. The first step is typically some kind of research or discovery. And what we mean by that is that we want to learn two things. We want to learn about stakeholders inside of a company, and we want to learn about users of the product or service that we're going to design for. So on the images on the right, you can see some of the activities that we'll get involved in that discovery process. The image at the top is a team of ours interviewing a user of enterprise software in an office somewhere. She's got a desk, she's at a cubicle, she has some monitors, and what we're learning there is how she does her job, how she thinks about her job, and all of the environmental factors that matter to her, so that we can get a better understanding of what motivates her in her daily life. So you can see these little pieces of tape kind of taped along to her monitor. They've got little things written on them. We want to know what those are. It's not just about understanding what her daily tasks are. We need to understand what kind of environment she operates in and what sorts of things she cares about. The image in the middle is a group of stakeholders, and we're using a technique called dot voting to sort of help understand the expression of that company's brand and how they want to reflect that in a user interface. That's a really key aspect of what we do, because brand is, of course, very central to most companies' operations, and the product ends up reflecting that brand in a lot of ways. So we need to kind of reflect the brand in just the right way. So if a user interface is going to be sharp or transmit this sort of attribute of intelligence or quality or luxury, we need to know what those attributes are so that we can reflect it in the brand. The third image at the bottom is a group of doctors, and this is another sort of key aspect of our process and discovery, which is to borrow some techniques from anthropology and actually observe our users sort of in their daily working environment. In this case, we're following doctors around and watching them do their work, because we need to understand not only the tools they use, but also the other people involved. So we want to see who they talk to and how doctors and nurses interact, and what sorts of activities they engage in. So all of that information is really critical to understanding the root problem, because that's really the key sort of goal of this first phase, is to understand what are the root issues, what are the root goals that the business has, and what are the root motivators of the users themselves. So we take all of that information, and then we do the hard part. The hard part is making sense of it all, because there's so much data. There's so many different perspectives. We've heard from all the stakeholders. We've watched a lot of users and sort of try to understand what they need. And then we have to make sense of it. So what we do is we take it and we call it synthesis. We take all the data and we sort of mash it up into these artifacts, these objects or models that we can understand more easily, and that stakeholders can understand more easily. So at the top, you see an example of a journey map or a diagram that kind of explains the flow of data and activity and touch points between users and a service or a product. In the middle, you see this guy's face on a slide. That's sort of part of what we call a persona. A user persona is kind of a model of users. It's not a real person. It's an archetype. It's a sort of one example of a user, and it describes in very human terms what they want or need and what their real goals are, so that we can have empathy for them and design really compelling solutions for them. So that's another key artifact that we create with all of that observation data and all the stakeholder data that we've collected. The last image there is a storyboard, and here's where we start to actually do design. So we take those personas, those user models, and we start to tell stories about them, because before we get to this phase, we really don't know yet what exactly the solution will be. And here even, we're saying, we're not even sure which goals we want to serve, which user goals are more important than others. And so what we do is we tell lots of stories about this user, and we try to figure out which of these experiences that we tell a story about are more important than others, so that we can make sure we're solving the right problem. Because that's the big idea here in this second phase of synthesis, is to make sure we're solving the right problem. There are lots of problems to solve in the world, and only time to solve a few of them. So we want to make sure we're not wasting effort and time, and making sure we're going in the right direction. This third phase is where things start to get visual. And this is what people usually think of when they think of design. But in our opinion, a lot of design happens before this phase. But here's where it starts to get visual. We start to do ideation. We start to create rough prototypes. We start to actually express the brand in the user interface in a visual way. It's what we call visual design or UI design. So a lot of these activities start to happen in this phase that we call design framework, which is just a sort of a jargony name for a set of activities that's really about kind of figuring out what the big high-level picture is for this thing. And you can see that a lot of those artifacts are, really rough. They're really sketchy. They've got little line drawings or pen drawings, a whiteboard, and that's because we really strongly believe that we don't want to make any commitment to the user interface before we have really clear thinking about it. So we say at Cooper, we say that the fidelity, the level of detail of the things that we're drawing should match the fidelity or the level of detail of our thinking about it. And so when you see these rough sketches, that means our thinking is really still rough and sketchy. So we don't want to get too far ahead of the thinking in terms of the actual design. And the reason for that is that when we change our minds, when we make a new decision, or when we explore a new solution, we don't want to have to go all the way back to start from scratch and create a really detailed solution all over again. That would be really expensive and very time consuming. So our goal here is to keep things at low fidelity. That means keeping it very sketchy so that we can iterate very quickly and change our mind and find the right solution by exploring. The output of this framework phase is some sort of information architecture, high-level navigation, the kind of big structure of the application that we're designing or the service that we're designing. And lastly, this phase, you could say, goes on forever. It starts with that framework that we've created, and then we basically add levels of detail as we think through it more carefully. So we call that design refinement. And that means we start to apply the visual style that we've created for that brand. We start to create more detailed prototypes that we can test carefully. Prototypes, of course, serve many purposes, one of which is to test. Another is to generate excitement inside of a company. So it's funny, one of the things that we do pretty often is build a detailed prototype so that executive stakeholders can get really excited about a solution. And that's another interesting use for prototypes that we found, and it's very valuable. It also generates buy-in from all the other stakeholders, so everyone understands the vision at a really clear level. And then, of course, you have to start building the solution. So, a company like Cooper will create artifacts like specifications and other things like it that'll help a development team kind of take the baton. We also tend to work in kind of short cycle or agile cycles depending on the client. Google we've worked with for many years, and they love to work in this kind of very fast iterative cycle process or sprint process. So some clients really get a lot of value out of that, and we can kind of embed in that process with them. So this is a really high-level overview of how Cooper does user experience design. And the great thing about this process is that it can be really applied to any kind of problem. And that I think is one of the key things that I really want to share with you, is that this kind of process, from discovery through synthesis and creating user models, and through kind of creating a high-level thought framework and adding successive layers of detail, can be applied to a lot of different problems, not just ones that involve user interfaces. So a lot of our clients ask us to apply this methodology to problems like engaging users or engaging their clients or customers, building communities, communicating certain messages to certain populations. So lots of different ways and lots of different industries that can use this kind of process. Just wanted to share one example with you. It's a company called Kerbo. Kerbo is an interesting concept. It was built by a Stanford scientist, a nutritionist at Stanford, who was trying to help young children or sort of teens and kids make healthy eating decisions. A lot of kids, especially in the United States, don't necessarily make good eating decisions, and so this program was meant to help communicate those decisions and help them make good decisions themselves and really empower them to do that. So the central challenge of building an app to support this program was that we wanted to, first of all, design something for children, which is not a typical population to design for, and also that we kind of help those kids want to use this app. So adoption was an important thing, and sort of helping them participate, as was helping the parents feel like they were connected to this program as well, because they of course want to monitor this and help their children go through the program and make good eating decisions. I'm going to show you a couple of, here's a visual, what we call style study, and this is, I was talking before about kind of how to reflect a brand in an interface. And this is one of the ways that we do that. We take a lot of just sort of example or sort of placeholder user interface elements, and we apply different kinds of brand attributes to each one so that we can see how different they are, And that's the point, is that they remain different, so that we can sort of feel that the client can look at this and say, you know, the style study you have up there on the right-hand side, up on the top right, that feels a little closer to the brand attributes that we had in mind, versus the one on the bottom right, which feels a little too sharp and angular. The one on the top right feels friendly and approachable. So we want that to be the way that the visual style manifests itself. And here's a couple of screenshots from the app itself. I'm going to actually break out of the presentation here because I want to show you a video of the process that we engaged in to actually do this. And I hope you guys can see this video over Hangouts. So here we go.
She started to gain weight, and it just continued to go up. And every time we went to the pediatrician's office, she had gained over the average of what she should gain.
There's lots of weight loss tools that are available for adults, but there's nothing that's been approved as safe and effective for kids. And that lack of support was really leaving parents feeling helpless and frustrated, and set up a dynamic where parents felt like they needed to micromanage what their kids were eating, which is a bad situation for both parents and kids.
It was getting to the point where I was dreading dinners. Tyler would sit down and take a portion of food, but if he ate it too fast or if he went for seconds, it just became this kind of like tense situation, and it was really uncomfortable for all of us.
Kurbo is a program that's designed specifically for kids and their families, and through one-on-one coaching and an interactive mobile app, it helps them learn the tools that they need in order to make healthy choices and lose weight.
So rather than focusing on calorie counting, which isn't really effective or even safe for kids, the Kurbo program is built on a Stanford model that helps kids understand foods in terms of sort of green light, that are easy, good foods, yellow lights that should be taken account of, and red lights, which are sort of really bad foods. And the program helps them not only to be aware of this difference, but to minimize the number of reds and yellows that they consume over time. And in order for tracking to become a daily habit, the barrier to entry had to be low, and that's where Cooper came in. The team at Cooper spent our time designing and redesigning a system that was both fun and fast, and to do that, we grounded our thinking in several sessions with kids. It included research beforehand, participatory design during, and feedback sessions with live demos afterward.
One of the exercises that we did with the kids was we had them make collages to show us what their ideal coach would be like. And so they were cutting pictures out of magazines to show us kind of the character and tone that their ideal coach would have. And that really helped us to make it just right so that the system didn't feel like it was nagging them, and it didn't feel like it was being too much of a cheerleader, but it was someone who was going to be cool and approachable and fun, so that they always felt like the Kurbo coach had their back.
I like that when you track your food, you know that like, oh, I did a little over on this day, and I did good on this day, and I did a little bad on that day, so you can like kind of plan of what you're gonna have on each day. That's what I like about the tracking, and the games, they're just fun.
In early tests, Kurbo Health worked with kids between the ages of 8 and 18 and reported an 85% success rate in reducing their body mass index over the course of the 10-week program. Those who tracked their food on Kurbo lost more weight, and many lost 10 pounds or more of excess body weight over the 10-week program. And most excitingly, 90% of the kids continued with the program after the trial period.
And actually, at our last pediatrician's office, the doctor was so happy with Alana and her Kurbo success that she hugged her in the office because she was so happy with everything Alana's done with Kurbo.
I think Kurbo's been a big help in my life. Since I've started Kurbo, I do feel differently, energy-wise, confidence-wise, and just appearance-wise.
Awesome. So who knew we could get kids to not eat junk food? That's amazing. But it kind of shows you how you can bring together participatory design in any population. Excuse me. Participatory design and kind of prototyping at a really low fidelity so that we can understand some key behavioral patterns and use that to create a great and compelling design. that's really successful. The key idea behind all of this is this word goal. And user experience design is often called user-centered design. You may have heard of that. At Cooper, we call it goal-directed design. In other words, goals should direct our design efforts. And so what we do is we try to understand what these goals are as quickly as possible, because that's really the sort of meat of what we're doing. Just to give you a sense of what goals mean and why they're important. Goals are important because they're really stable. As many of you may have experienced, if you're in the software industry, requirements can change every day, and it feels like sometimes there's a little bit of whiplash when another manager comes in and says, here's a new set of requirements that are different from the old, and you feel like you have to constantly keep up with this. With by studying user goals, we can stop that kind of thrash around what really needs to get built, and we can focus our attention on really kind of the root issues. So what's great about goals is that they're stable. Back in 150 years ago, if someone wanted to travel around in North America, especially get one of these covered wagons, and you'd hitch up some horses, and you would just start moving, and you might go 1,000 miles, but you still wanted to get there as quickly as possible, and you wanted to be safe and comfortable. And those same goals are true today. Even all this time later. So the goals haven't changed at all. What's changed, of course, is the context. And the tasks and the tools. So 150 years ago, it took a lot of time. It took a lot of money. You had to sort of bring your own comfort, and it was often very dangerous. In today's world, it takes very little time. The cost is dramatically lower. And comfort is provided for you in some cases, in other cases not. There's different things to do. Like you needed to bring 1 book versus 50 books, but so all of those contextual things have changed. And of course, then the design solution changes. But as far as goals are concerned, we can always focus on those very stable goals, and that helps us ground our design in the real world and what people really care about and need. So we're not always chasing the latest tool or task. Let me tell you a bit about my career path. I studied economics and mathematics and computer science in university. And these things are very technical fields, but what it led me to was some quantitative analysis work for the US government and as an economist. And what I did there was, it turned out, a lot of communication design, because a lot of policy making is about telling a story about the data. So I learned some really kind of key insights around how to use stories to communicate in my early career. I thought maybe I should go to law school. I decided not to. And then I moved to San Francisco, where I started working as a QA engineer for a fintech startup that turned out they were working on a similar data set that the federal government was working on. So it was a nice fit, and I learned a lot of engineering concepts there and how software was built. Then I switched roles. I became a product manager at that same company. And it turns out product management is a really interesting and diverse field, and so I had a lot of things to learn once I switched over into that. Product management really kind of broadened my scope from being an engineer to caring about not just the technical implementation and the details around that, but also the user experience and the business strategy. So product management is really the intersection of all 3 of those things: business strategy, user experience, and user needs, and then the technical implementation side. And that was a really fun job. A lot of people get MBAs or something along those lines, and I thought about that too. And I said, no, you know what? I'm learning all of this in my current job, and I think I don't need to get that extra education. So I stayed on as a product manager until we were acquired by Thomson Reuters, which is a large multinational media company. And rose into a management position there as a director of product management. We built tools for institutional financial managers, so people running hedge funds and mutual funds and portfolio managers and so on. Then I left Thomson Reuters and I joined Cooper as an interaction designer. And here's where I took my product management skills and I really kind of focused on the strategic and the user experience side of things, because that was where I had the most fun. So this is where I also spent some time at a startup called BuildZoom, where I was the director of product design, which is another kind of intersection of jobs. Product design is, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's the intersection of interaction design or user experience design with UI, visual design, and product management. So all three of those things is what I did at BuildZoom. Then I came back to Cooper as a director, and now I run the Cooper San Francisco studio. So you can see I've had a very diverse and kind of winding path through my career, but I think all of these are in service of what we're doing now at Cooper, which is to answer these big questions for companies about, you know, what do users really need and how do we shape the business in order to give them that. So design is many things, and you might have heard a lot of these in the context of design. They're all synonyms in some ways. They all sort of look at different aspects of what I'll call design. There's UX design, which is actually kind of an umbrella that you could fit a lot of these things into. I'm sure you've heard of UI design, which is really kind of the visual side of things and actually crafting the specific interaction, the specific detailed user interface, typically of a screen. Graphic design is, comes from the print world, and that actually is sort of one of the inputs to our process, which is how to express things on a flat surface, on paper sometimes, but we translate that into a digital context, usually. Visual design is kind of all of those things. So it's graphic design and user interface design, kind of all put together in one. Design strategy is, okay, now we understand the user experience we want. How do we get there? How do we make it work? How do we use the business resources to kind of translate things from one to the other? And if you're a product manager, you're probably recognizing a lot of things that you think about every day in terms of strategy and getting somewhere and understanding user goals, because there's actually quite a lot of overlap. And I think user experience designers really occupy like one corner of that product management function. Information architecture is all about how information relates to itself and to other information, sort of in a hierarchy or an architecture. A lot of times that's involved in navigation of a large data set or large content set. Usability is how well a user can actually interact with something. Interaction design is kind of the fundamental aspects of wireframing. Service design is an even broader term that's come into use relatively recently in the past couple of years to describe how do we create bigger experiences that involve lots of different ways of interacting with a company. So if you think about a company who has a website, and they might have a portal and an application and maybe a web app or a mobile app, and then maybe they have a customer service department and there's a sales process, all of these ways in which users interact with a company, we want to design so that that's all a holistic experience and it all reflects positively on the company and reflects the brand in the same way. Cooper is an agency. This just means we're a consultancy. You've heard other words for this, maybe design firm, design shop, but it just means that we serve our clients and we give them specific kind of piece of what they need. It also helps us zoom out a little bit and come in as a third party that's credible, and we have a different perspective that's outside of a company. That can often be very helpful when businesses need to make change or when they need to make hard decisions. We can help them do that. So really it comes down to this. This is what we do at Cooper. We ask the question, what should we make? What should a company make? We help them answer that. And then we answer the question, how should it work? So it's really both of those things. It's not just the how should it work part. It's not just how should the screen look and how should it behave. But what we do is we answer that fundamental question about users. What should we make? What should the users get? What do they want? We do that by studying business goals and studying user goals, and then putting them together and saying, how do we get the best of both worlds and create the best solution for both cases? Things that a user experience designer would deliver or make. These are just sort of things that you could expect to do in the course of your work. And again, if you're a product manager or you know about product management, you'll recognize some of these things because again, I think there's a lot of deep overlap in terms of some of the functions that user experience designers and product managers typically find themselves doing. Wireframes, branding, product roadmap is one that product managers typically usually own, but user experience designers can really offer a really important, I think, insight into, because as a product roadmap evolves, the design strategy will need to change, and as user goals are uncovered, you know, that needs to be reflected in the roadmap and so on. So it's really a collaboration, I think, between a product team and design team. Specifications is another thing that product managers sometimes create. Sometimes it's user experience designers. A lot of times, user experience designers will create specifications that are much more functional. So here's how things, you know, clicking on this button makes something happen, and here's how. Whereas product managers might create kind of, you know, higher level specifications around requirements. A style guide is kind of a way, a sort of a template for how visual design is expressed, and a way for development teams to sort of consume that visual design. Research insights, these are things that, you know, a user experience designer has to create once they've synthesized all that information and, you know, created user personas and other artifacts like that. We want to deliver back the insights from the research. What did we see when we went out in the field and looked at it and observed these users behave in their daily work? You know, what are the new opportunities that we saw in the market as we did that work, and so on. User models we talked about. Journey maps are another really common artifact these days. Journey maps are really important, especially at the sort of strategic level, and I think is another point where product managers and UX designers can have a really deep conversation about, you know, how do users interact with a product or a service over time, and how do they evolve what they're thinking. So let's get to the meat of it, which is careers in design. I'm going to just give you, you know, my short take on this, which is here's a bunch of career titles, and I'll sort of talk about what they are, what the differences are between them, and I'd love to start answering your questions about these in a second. But I won't go too deep into them. But I would love to hear about what you guys want to hear about. But basically, if you go and search on a job board somewhere, you might see some of these design job titles. The first one is interaction designer or UX designer. Those are really kind of similar roles that involve both strategy and information architecture and wireframing. Visual design is, again, very much about the pixel perfect nature. How does a brand get expressed in a UI? So that you'll see sometimes as UI designer. That's a visual designer. There's this new term, at least in the US market, called product designer. Product designer is sometimes confusing because a lot of times people say product design when they mean the design of a physical product. In other words, an industrial designer. But in a lot of cases in the US, when you see product designer on a job board, it often means that it's someone who can do both user experience design and visual design. And a lot of times, you know, we're from San Francisco, so there's lots of startups everywhere, just like there are here in Bangalore. And you know, a lot of times companies want to hire one person instead of two, so they want to try and find someone who has both skill sets, and that's typically a product designer. Design researcher, I'd like to pause on this a little bit because it's a specialty. It's one of those phases that we talked about before about discovery, but it's a lot of people today are specializing in it because it's actually a really deep field. And as I said before, it borrows from a lot of social science research techniques like anthropology, and it requires a deep understanding of human behavior and psychology. So if you have a background in psychology or one of the sort of social sciences like economics or anthropology, this can be a really interesting entry point to user experience design because it's not necessarily visual, it's much more about understanding people and translating that into deep insights that you can communicate well. So one of the key aspects of being a great design researcher is communication. That is being able to write effectively and create presentations and speak to a group of people and kind of convince them of an insight that they weren't there to witness. So storyteller is another way to say design researcher. Related to these, as I've said over and over again, product managers are very closely related to user experience designers in a lot of ways, but of course they have many other duties and many other capabilities and functions. But design and understanding the user is, of course, a big part of product management. So product managers and UX designers should be very closely partnered in any organization. They should have a close relationship, and they should share information. Business analyst is another role that can mean lots of things, and you know, but sometimes I see it in the U.S. market as a title for someone who does do this kind of workflow analysis and information architecture. So sometimes business analysts will have that role as well. So there are these other related fields that are kind of similar and adjacent to interaction or UX design. So I'm going to stop sharing so you can see my face again, and maybe we can jump into questions. You guys have any questions from the field there?
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions from an audience. First of all, Nate, I would like to thank you because I think a lot of slides were very informative, and especially the slide which actually explained the difference between different designations and what people do in job role. Because if you see in UX, a lot of times a lot of designations are very hazy. As in, a UX person might do everything from research to actually designing it. And a lot of times people do think, what exactly is a UX person supposed to do? And if he's supposed to do that, then who is supposed to do the research part? Or, should a UX designer even know about user research? Or is it even important? So I think all those doubts you very well cleared throughout your presentation. And so we'll quickly move to the questions now. So the first question which we have is, I want to become a UX designer. Is there any prerequisite for the same? And how do I start? What should I do just to get started?
That's a great question. And there are many ways to do that. The first thing I would do is start to read. There's a lot to read online about this question. And there are a lot of interesting thought leaders who talk a lot about how products work and how they connect to user goals. So I would start with that, and I would try to study. There are a ton of books about this, but I think you can get a lot of information online just to get a sense of the industry and get a sense of what is it that a designer, a user experience designer does every day. So make sure that sounds really interesting and fulfilling to you first. I think that's step one. And then keep reading, because those things will get updated and there'll be new thoughts all the time. And that's how I started with it, which was actually to read some of the early books that Alan Cooper wrote. Alan Cooper, who founded Cooper, I started reading his books while I worked at StarMine. He wrote a book called About Face, which is in its 4th edition now. It's kind of the sort of textbook for interaction design that's used in a lot of US graduate programs for interaction design and for human-computer interaction. So that's a great book. You can pick that up and look at that. It has a lot of interesting design principles around product design and how to delight users. But then there are a lot of other books that also describe that. I think another way to get into it is, as I said, kind of understanding the role of design researcher, which can be a really, really interesting kind of deep field, and doesn't necessarily require any kind of visual kind of skill set in advance. I was sort of under the misimpression before I got into this industry that I needed to learn how to draw. I needed to be an artist. And that's actually not the case at all. I almost went to art school. I should have put that on my list, but I didn't. Because actually user experience design is much more about understanding people. So, so anything you can do to understand kind of the key aspects of design research is kind of where I would start.
Got you. Yeah, so another question which we have with us is, UI designer has to collaborate with UX designer and vice versa. And then finally they need to give an input to the developers. So do you have any tips, when UI developers collaborate with UI designers collaborate with UX designers to finally give the input to developers? How should they go about it?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, The first thing is that I think UI designers are often left out of the conversation when it comes to understanding user insights. So a lot of times, you know, people want to sort of take the visual designers and say, all you need to do is do the visual design. And in fact, the visual design has a very deep connection to the kind of user goals and the other you know, kind of user insights that come out of user experience design. So I think the best advice would be to get them involved and get them bought into the user research itself. So help them understand what it is at a deep level and collaborate on that first. And then once you've agreed on a visual strategy, a visual direction for the visual design for the front end layer, to work together in a process that you can iterate, and that's not just a handoff from one user experience designer with a wireframe to a visual designer who then applies some styles to it. You want it to be a collaboration between the two of you, because inevitably there'll be some push and pull, some changes that have to be made, but to collaborate one-on-one in that kind of in that realm, I think is important. As far as the handing them off to developer piece, a lot of companies do this in different ways, and we found that you know, creating a separate visual style guide is often really useful and efficient. So often the visual designer can focus on that. What we do at Cooper is we illustrate the whole experience with kind of slightly lower fidelity wireframes, and then what we do is we pick basically a few different screens in that flow, or a few different experiences that kind of capture the essence of it, and we apply visual design to each one of those and use that to specify the UI itself. And we found that just doing that makes it more efficient, so that the UI designer doesn't have to draw every single screen. They can just draw what we call archetype screens or example screens, and that can be much more efficient than as the UX designer can make changes to the wireframes or to the user flow without disrupting the whole process. So that can be an efficient way to work.
Got you. That explains a lot. And I'll move quickly to the next question, which is related to visual design. So we have a question which states, which are the different tools which are used for visual design? Is it just Photoshop, or there are other professional tools which are being used, you know, increasingly used in the industry?
Yeah, the one tool that comes to mind that's really kind of taken our offices, especially by storm, is called Sketch, and it's an application it's for Mac only, unfortunately. So if you have a Windows machine, then you won't be able to use it. But it's a really powerful tool for visual design because it handles bitmap and vector kind of equally well, and so it kind of brings the best of both worlds from Photoshop and from Illustrator. And it's relatively inexpensive. It's only like $75 or something, and you don't have to pay a subscription to Adobe for that. So it's actually a really great tool, and they're updating it really quite frequently. They've started to add new workflow tools that are specific to UI design, like artboards and symbols that you can copy and paste throughout your user flow or your wireframes and sketches and flows, and then update in one place and they update in all the other places. So it's very efficient, and I've seen a lot of visual designers, especially in the US, use that tool. It's called Sketch. I think the company that makes it is called Bohemian Coding, but I'm sure you can find it online. Again, it's Mac only.
Got you. Yeah, I can relate to it because Sketch, I've used it like not very frequently, like slightly, but yeah, it does. I think it has a very good user interface, at least. That's what I did understand out of it. Yeah, so we have a next question. While a project roadmap is being discussed, is there any role which a UX designer plays in that project roadmap discussion? Or is it more of a product manager leads it and UX designer is out of conversation pretty much?
That's a really good question because it speaks to sort of the collaboration between product managers and designers, and that relationship can be fraught. It can be tense, and because I think product managers really want to own the end-to-end experience, the end-to-end product, and user experience designers really want to give their input in terms of what are the real user goals here. So I think the user experience designer's primary role in terms of understanding a product roadmap would be to constantly remind the team about the persona that they're using, the people that they're designing this for, and help to make those ideas about users and the kind of deep user goals, the ones that are stable, that don't change over time, help them stay front of mind for the whole team. So that's really important because it, I think a lot of people on a product team will forget. They'll start to refer to themselves as, well, I want the product to do this. And the user experience designer can say, well, what we really want is for the product to serve our customers or our users. And so constantly remind the team and kind of keep those ideas front and center. That could be the most valuable thing that a designer does. And I think by doing that, you'll gain an appreciation for kind of the product management perspective, and the product manager will gain an appreciation for the design perspective, and then I think you'll work together more effectively.
Got you. And so moving to the next point, how important is it for a UX designer to know about user research?
It's pretty much essential. I would say at Cooper, we all of our user experience designers also do the research themselves. So we don't ever have researchers hand over research to a designer who then designs. Because to us, at least, the purpose of design is, or the real driving factor of design is empathy. So we want to care about the person that we're designing for. And so that's a really important point. Now, that's not the case at every company. And I think especially at larger companies, look at Netflix or Facebook, they have whole teams devoted just to user research. And they produce a lot of data and insights, and then they hand it over to the user experience design team. And that can totally work. And I think the way that happens, though, is that the UX design team still has to be involved in some way. So what we do is when we go out and do research, we bring some of our clients with us, actually. We want them along with us. We want them sitting next to us. So these might be, a head of marketing or a head of product or, someone in the support department sitting next to us as we do the research. And if you're a UX designer and you have user researchers who are doing that separately, then I think one of the best things you could do is go on the research trips with them. Just go as an observer if you have to, but get some of those stories and get some of that insight firsthand, even if it's just a little bit. And I think your work will be much better for it.
Got you. So yeah, I think the entire gist of user experience is understanding the user and fulfilling their needs. So unless you understand your user real well and you fulfill their needs, the chances of them using your product might not be that high. So maybe may it be a product manager or may it be a UX designer, it's very important to kind of know about your user. And that brings me to my next question also. In one of the slides, as you had mentioned, that even a business analyst, for that matter, needs to know about user experience. So if you could, the question is, how does knowing user experience help a business analyst, and how does it in turn affect the overall project?
Well, as I said, I think business analysts can mean a lot of different things. But in a lot of cases, business analysts are helping to translate business goals into some other detailed form. So there might be a high-level business goal of, we want revenue growth of some kind, or we want to increase engagement in some way, some KPI that the business analyst is on a team that might help kind of say, well, here's how we would go about doing that. But of course, to influence revenue or to influence some other KPI, you really need to understand the user experience of the product you're selling or the service that you're selling. So in order to create good solutions, I think a business analyst needs to be in this kind of translation role. And one of the inputs to their job should be design. So as much as they can understand the output of design, I think the better off they'll be. The other thing I've seen business analysts do, as I said, was things like workflow analysis, or really trying to understand kind of the pathway of data through a system. And again, that's related to, the end user and also all of the systems involved in delivering that. And all of those things are connected. So if you think about these kind of large scale systems as in a holistic way, you realize that anyone in a position to sort of take take the project from one step to the next, or to translate things, kind of needs to know how what they do connects to the rest of the organization and to the rest of the product. So to the extent that business analysts are doing that analysis, that workflow analysis, I think they also need to understand whose workflow is it and who are the people affected by the decisions they're making. But to the extent they're kind of delivering on strategies for different KPIs inside of business, I think they also need to understand the end result and how it connects to what they're doing.
Got you. Thank you so much for your answer, Nate. And another question, which is basically there is, while you hire a UX designer, what are the qualities which you look for in a UX designer? You have hired n number of people till date. So if you could just explain us, what do you look for candidates in interviews? Who, as per you, should be the ideal UX designer? Then that would be great.
UX designers at Cooper are what we look for is not necessarily that they have a huge portfolio. What I'm really looking for when I hire a user experience designer is someone who has great critical thinking skills and great communication skills and some understanding of the value of the design process. So that could be an industry veteran who's worked on lots of big projects and has a really great portfolio and can show all their work. And it might be someone who comes from architecture and has no user experience portfolio, but has worked on a few problems where they've demonstrated that capability and have like a really interesting kind of different perspective on design. So we look in a lot of different industries. We also look at graduate schools like Carnegie Mellon, places where really top candidates are kind of learning these kinds of skills. But I think these skills are acquirable in a lot of places, and not necessarily at an expensive university. I think they are things that people can acquire in their professional lives, as I did. I did not go to school for user experience design. I learned a lot of that on the job. I learned it during my product management days, and I slowly built a level of understanding and skill around that, and combined that with communication skill, because that's ultimately part of the job. There's a really great, there's a lot of thinking around design, but I think one of the things that people miss is that design is really about communication. So at Cooper, it doesn't really help us if we have a great designer, the best designer in the world, who can't explain their work, right? Who can't like sell their work almost to the client or to us, right? So we need people who are able to communicate their design just as much as someone who's a whiz-bang artist. And so those two things are really kind of important to know.
Got you. So lastly, I think we have pretty much covered a lot of questions and pretty much have cleared a lot of doubts around various aspects from UX designer to product manager to business analyst. So if you could just want to summarize any message or any advice which you'd like to give to aspiring UX designers, for maybe UI designers who want to move to UX designers, what would that piece of advice be?
I think my main piece of advice would be, after you go and kind of read about this topic, because there's a lot being written about it, is to try it on your own. I've talked to a lot of college students about this, and they don't really teach UX design at sort of the undergraduate university level in the US, but people are really interested in this field. And so I answer a lot of questions. How do I get into this? What do I do? And one of my first pieces of advice is go and try. Go and just do it. Because a lot of this is practice. A lot of this is, everything from design research through wireframing, through strategy, is all just reading and practice. And unless you get your hands dirty and start doing it, you won't get that practice. So don't wait for someone to pay you to do that job. Don't wait for someone to give you that title. Just go ahead and actually start doing it and demonstrate that. The worst case is that you make a few rookie mistakes, and that's great. Then you can move on to the next thing. And if you just keep trying, you'll start to build a body of knowledge and a body of experience that you can use to get into that. The other thing is, especially as, if you're already a UI designer, that means you work at a company where design is a function. So, one way you can get into UX is to take your UX colleagues to lunch and say, hey, how do I kind of help you out? You know, what can I do to learn about the specific trade that you guys have, or the specific tools and skills that you have in your job? And that's another tool that I've used in my past career, which is, you know, if there's a new role that I want to play, go to those people and say, what do I need to know in order to be someone who does this job? And I think that can be a really valuable source of information.
Got you. Thank you so much for all the information you have shared with us, Nate, and thank you so much for making time to actually come to the UpGrad Bangalore office. And just in case you guys are not aware, Nate is here for a Agile India conference, and in fact, he has a talk tomorrow, which is scheduled in the evening in the Agile India Conference 2017. Yeah, and in case you wish to hear more from him, you can always visit the conference, or else you can drop your questions on an email ID, and we will definitely pass them on to Nate and get all your queries answered. So yeah, that is pretty much for it. Thank you so much everyone for coming. Thank you, Nate. And we had a great time and very informative time. Thank you.
So much fun. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.